Good morning and welcome everyone to today's IFSEC Global webinar, where we'll be discussing the integration of technology to manage fire safety risk in social housing. Thank you to FireAngel for sponsoring today's session, alongside all the panelists who I'll introduce shortly. I'm James Moore, editor of IFSEC Global, and I'll be moderating today's session. Just a few things to note before we get started. This webinar is designed to be interactive, so please do ask any questions you have and would like answered by panelists in the Q&A box. We've got several items for discussion already on the agenda, but have left some time throughout and at the end for audience questions. And if you do ask a question, please make it clear if the question is directed at a particular panelist, just so I know who to direct it to. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will also allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and ask for any technical assistance, should you need it. And if you'd like to watch the webinar back, or you have any internet issues or connectivity problems, don't worry, this will be recorded and available to watch back on demand. Towards the end of our webinar, we'll ask you to complete a survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please just take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will help provide us with valuable information for future events. And that's about it for everything. So what are we discussing today and why? So over the next hour, we'll be focusing on how technology, such as the Internet of Things, or IoT, as it is often referred to as, and connected devices can be used and embraced to better manage fire safety risks. There will be a particular emphasis on social housing here, but the topic is obviously applicable across the fire safety sector, from residential through to commercial. Technology is, of course, a fairly vague and all-encompassing term, I realise. What we'll really be looking into here is connected technology, in terms of how fire safety devices such as alarms can be linked to cloud-based software, enabling benefits such as remote monitoring for installers, landlords, housing providers, fire rescue services, and everybody else. Of course, since the invention of Grenfell, fire safety in residential buildings, particularly high-rise, has very much been at the forefront of the agenda for government and the industry alike. The subsequent investigations and inquiries have uncovered many issues. One particular area of concern is that of managing the risk of vulnerable and disabled residents, something that technology and IoT devices can certainly support in, which we'll be discussing today. As far as an agenda goes, we'll be splitting the discussion into two key areas, really, which will leave plenty of room for discussion and input from our panelists. First, we will try and understand what we really mean when we say technology and IoT in fire safety, as we discuss the evolution of devices, why it's becoming such an important conversation, and what the major benefits are for stakeholders in general. We'll then move on to discuss how the industry can get more engaged with this debate going forwards, and in particular, how social housing providers and responsible persons can engage residents so that such tech can be really embraced and utilised to the best of its abilities. So who do we have joining us for today's discussion? You can probably see many of their faces on the screen, so I'll introduce each one in turn. Firstly, we have Nick Rutter, co-founder and chief product officer at FireAngel Safety Technology. Hi, Nick. Do you want to just introduce yourself quickly? You're on mute, Nick.
That was a cliche of last year, wasn't it? I'm on mute. Thank you, James. Thank you for the introduction. I've been working in the fire safety space now for just over 20 years. For the entire life of FireAngel, I've led the technology strategy in the direction of where the technology in the business is going. And what I'm really passionate about is the potential of IoT to not only change our industry, but change it in a way that could take fire safety to a level that nobody in the industry even thought was possible, maybe even 10 years ago. So it's actually a very, very exciting time to be in the industry at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And second, we have Ian Moore, Chief Executive Officer at the Fire Industry Association, or FIA as it's known. I'm sure many people recognise you're Ian, but do you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. As you quite rightly said, the CEO of the FIA, I've been here 6 years. It doesn't seem that long, but it's drifted past rather quickly. I've been in the industry even longer than you, Nick, 30 years, I think, based on following my sort of military brief career. I also believe in innovation, and I've been lucky enough previously to win the Queen's Award for Innovation when I brought to the market video smoke detection. So I've always had a push towards looking for new ways of doing things, better way of doing things, and I often see barriers which stifle innovation in the fire industry. And I work very, very hard to sort of try and remove those barriers. I fully understand why they're there in the way of approvals, compliance for life safety purposes, but we've got to get better at bringing new technologies forward. There are many, many available out there, and the IoT is a specific interest, which I'll talk about later about us and the FIA, because it touches so many areas. Data is king, and we can use data to define our futures. Anyway, good morning, everybody.
Perfect, thank you, Ian. Next, we have Jason Avery, the Assistant Director for Prevention and Protection with Hampshire and Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service. Jason, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your role?
Certainly, thanks, James. Morning, everybody. Yeah, Jason Avery, been with Hampshire and Isle of Wight Fire and Rescue Service for 27 years now. My current role as Assistant Director for Prevention and Protection enables me to direct resources within our county fire and rescue service to primarily making sure people are safe in the workplace. But what we'll be talking about today is about making sure people are safe at home, on the roads, and when they're near water. So, you know, my interest is primarily directed around how do we connect technology to people, and how do we make those people safer when they reside at home. And certainly those that are more vulnerable from fire and other accidents within the home environment. And you know, we've worked with FireAngel over a number of years now, supplying smoke detection through our safe and well visits, and now with emerging technology that Nick was talking about earlier. You know, there's some frontiers here now that are being pushed that will enable us to more readily understand what kind of risk there is in communities. So I'm really interested to hear from the other presenters today as well. Thanks, James.
Spot on, thank you. And also joining us is Fazile Hadi, Head of Policy at Disability Rights UK and member of the Disability Advisory Committee of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Morning, Fazile. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, James. And I'm very, very pleased to be with you all. I'm not sure my camera's working, but I hope you can. It is working, fantastic. I asked that because I'm blind, everyone, so it's I can't tell. So just to introduce Disability Rights UK, we're a pan-disability organisation, which means that we represent people with a range of impairments. We're led by disabled people, which means that our trustees and the majority of our staff are disabled, so we speak from lived experience. And we believe in something called the social model of disability, which is really about how we can all think differently to take away some of the barriers that disabled people face, which is very relevant to our discussion today. So how do we build a world where we're thinking about the physical barriers, the information barriers, and taking them down? I've become involved to a very small degree in fire safety this year. And I've been active with other disabled people in trying to make sure that personal emergency evacuation plans are put in place for disabled people. And I'm sure I'll have a chance to talk more about that later.
Absolutely. Thank you all. I think we'll just kick off straight into the discussion. Nick, I think if we start with your side, if that's okay. Vendors are obviously often at the forefront of technological innovation. You often have to be the ones to kind of look ahead and predict future opportunities and challenges. How have you seen technology evolve in the fire safety sector over the years, and what are the major developments currently happening?
I think traditionally development within the fire safety sector has been relatively slow. If I look back within the domestic space, probably the two big innovations which have moved into the mainstream more recently will be having multi-sensor devices and wireless interconnect. But I remember looking at both those technologies around 2000. So it's taken an awful long time for them to move into the mainstream. And that's for a whole host of reasons related to attitudes of purchasers. You know, standards by definition will always like the technology, and as the technology accelerates with IoT type technology, that's going to become an increasing challenge. But where I'm very positive about the future is you look at those two innovations. Improving sensing, it's really important. Removing the basic interconnect wire to allow quicker and more cost-effective interconnected alarms, particularly in retrofit. And even that technology has really taken the new Scottish Tolerable Standard 2022. It's taken that standardisation to actually move that into the mainstream. Why I'm so positive about the future, if you look at the potential of IoT technology, it can improve installation, recording of installation, it can automate maintenance, automate reporting up to management. It can be used in real fast situations in order to improve the response. And then you have technology like FireAngel's Predict technology, where we're actually moving from active fire safety into predictive fire safety to potentially prevent fires even starting in the first place. So I genuinely believe that a lot more is going to happen in the next 10 years than has actually happened in the last 40. So I think we're moving into a really fertile and a really exciting period in domestic safety within the UK.
Excellent. And why do you think the industry is really now, you obviously mentioned it's been starting, some of this technology has been available since the early 2000s. Why do you think the industry is now ready to embrace it, maybe particularly in the social housing sector? I know FireAngel recently worked on an IoT-based project with Ealing Council, is that right? How's that worked and what's the process?
Yeah, it's a really good example, James. We are in the middle of a rollout of FireAngel connected alarms into 14,000 properties in the borough of Ealing. So probably one of the, if not the biggest, single IoT rollout in UK social housing history. I think how that project came about, we'd run a number of trials in social housing of our connected technology of tens or hundreds of devices. And that really created a case study to understand the holistic benefits of this technology. So if you're looking very narrowly at fire safety, it might seem logical just to replace your current detectors maybe to the LD2 standard, maybe upgrade it to LD1, often LD3, the basic standard, only to LD2. But when you actually look at the end-to-end benefits of using a connected system, so the fact that you've got all the documentation about your install is captured automatically. Every single event that happens on the platform is captured. You get an automatic risk stratification, so you can pinpoint those that are most vulnerable. So you can use your resource around your, I suppose, your community fire safety most effectively. You're future-proofing yourself in a number of ways. So two really good examples. One, a lot of people watching the webinar will be aware of Dame Judith Hackett's concept of a golden thread, where all information around the building is held digitally. A lot of that information around the domestic fire safety system is automatically captured. And I think with Ealing, they put an IoT infrastructure into high-rise, which is being used for the FireAngel connected alarm system, but it's also now being used for other systems like video door entry. So you're creating an infrastructure to add other technologies on in the future. So you look at that holistically, there are huge benefits. And by adopting wireless technology to move from LD2 to LD1 with a mix of mains powered and Steel for Life battery powered devices, they were actually able to deliver that project within the budget they had just for traditional replacement of alarms. So it breaks the perception that going to IoT technology is going to be phenomenally expensive. You can actually take advantage of all these benefits, but within your existing budget.
Excellent. Yeah, it seems to be another way for, and we already, fire and security, for example, already cross over quite well, but with IoT devices, it just seems like another aspect of all of that for both end users and installers, I think. Jason, from your perspective in the fire and rescue services, how has the use of technology evolved over the past few years, and what difference do you think it's making to improving safety and saving lives? And I think Nick touched on this already, but is this going to make a real difference for kind of meeting that golden thread of information that Dave Hackett pointed out a few years back?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we go back 20 years where single point detection was being promoted by the fire rescue sector. It was fraught with a number of issues. Not only were they limited in what they could the functionality and how they worked, but also issues we had where batteries were removed. Christmas time being used to power new presents as opposed to being left in detectors. We saw that evolution through to linked main powered detectors and those with 10-year batteries in that we've used prolifically over the last couple of years, but also changes to the building regulations. And I think public attitude has certainly seen a change in the number of fire-related injuries and deaths over the past couple of decades being reduced. So there's always been a place for detection, but as it's evolved and become more sophisticated, and as was previously stated there by Nick, it offers an opportunity now as we go forward for technology to really accelerate what we can do in terms of preventing incidents happening. I think we'll all recognise that smoke detection is a life-saving device, and it's readily available throughout the UK and abroad in DIY stores and through our Safe and Well visits that we provide at no charge at all. So accessing good detection isn't an issue. It's about what does good detection look like in the future. They've always been easy to install. Historically, we've been able to provide guidance to individuals to do that for themselves, or where they've required it, we've gone and done it on their behalf. And provided they meet the relevant safety regulations for your country, they pretty much look after themselves. And other than the weekly testicles, they're silently looking after people's safety. I think what the internet technologies are offering us, and certainly the software that's been put into the devices that FireAngel are now developing, gives us a much better understanding of risk in community. Of course, there's been for those people with other higher levels of vulnerability, we can access specialist devices that aid those with hearing impairment, for example. So, there has been previous development in technology, but I think there's still plenty to be sought in the future. And as we know, one thing is putting good detection into residents' accommodation, whether that's private dwellings or housing association. It does rely on people taking appropriate action when fire occurs. So it's not entirely reliant on technology. It also does rely on people understanding how that technology works and then taking the right action should there be an instance in the home.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll move on a little bit later into kind of the engagement process of all of this and sort of look into detail how residents can get involved and fully understand this. Ian, the FIA is obviously keen to explore IoT and its role in fire safety more. You obviously already mentioned that you've set up a special interest group on the topic. Can you tell us a little bit more about this, what its primary aims are, and how it's going to progress going forward?
The special interest group, I think, came first of all. We tend to use those to sort of get in and out of a subject. So usually with a definitive end to it, like a guidance document or a response to a government paper or something like that. I think we couldn't believe the amount of interest on this, and we've sort of closed it and made it more of a forum situation now. So the special interest group sort of stopped doing that because it's almost there's a whole host of little working groups coming off this. I don't think we fully understood the interest in it. I mean, I think we're all aware when we're involved with technology what the Internet of Things is all about. So I think we all got an inkling, and the clue's in the name. Internet is basically devices connected through internet, etc. So we've now moved into having a sort of more open forum. We've got a lot of information, and we've got people involved. Fire and rescue services. We've got British Standards involved. We've got Euralarm. are incredibly interested in the European stuff they're doing at the moment, coming into our forums because of the work we're doing on it. And overlapping, as mentioned before, into security, like the PSIA. So there's a whole host of stakeholders outside of our normal membership involved in this. So what we've come up to is we're trying to define it a little bit better, because it's such an enormous subject that where do you start? So you go round and round in circles, which you tend to for the first meeting, and then you sort of funnel it down to say, okay, what are we talking about here? And the areas we look at is communication, security, what things are in the Internet of Things, and then, of course, the management of that information. There's going to be lots of questions. I've seen them come up about cybersecurity. That is probably the number one concern about going deep into IoT from day one. And I think we all understand with fire alarm systems that have been involved with it some time, is getting the products to do the job is relatively straightforward. What's difficult to do is to make it do it consistently to the same standards and compliance, because they're life safety products. So what we're trying to look at is putting working groups together to sort of put platforms to discuss specific things like communication, like security, and what are the things that we deem to be fire. And that kind of stretches into other areas. I've been involved with sort of integration of systems for a long time. And again, somebody mentioned about security and fire being fully integrated. I'll give you a concept of something I wrote about 20 years ago, which kind of gives you an idea that if you put a fisheye lens camera in, for instance, in a room, through image processing, which was my background into fire, you can actually see smoke, you can see flames, you can see facial recognition, so why would you need access control all of a sudden? You can see put virtual tripwires in to see people coming in and out of rooms, therefore you don't need passive infrareds. You can even change the temperature in a room by looking at something on the wall that changes with temperature, so you can adjust it so no more thermostats. What I'm trying to say is that you can integrate all of these things for a common signal. And if you integrate all of those signals together, you get more. And the second bit I'd like to talk about really is about how people develop products, not just for development's sake, but are useful to the end users. And that's about data. And data, the more you have from the more phenomena in a room, the better chance you have to make a discerning decision. So if you can have devices that look at CO and sort of invisible gases, none of those going back to your old days of ionization and optical devices and flame detectors, you can have a whole array of those with data coming in. You can really work quite cleverly towards detecting at the earliest possible stage. And even interesting to hear Nick say about before the event, which, you know, obviously there is many phenomena in the air that come before that. I think we all know that to some degree, but that's interesting that you're doing that. And you do more preventative. So we're always into the prevention, not cure situation on the fire detection world. Whereas you move into the other side of fire and rescue, unfortunately, they get called when the cure situation is required. So we can try to put you out of a job here, Jason, by the way. So, you know, if we do our job properly, we don't need a fire and rescue service. But we all know that that's always going to happen. There always will be that scenario. And I was asked a question once, and I think it was in the House of Commons, I can't remember now, with someone of one of the working groups up there. And the accusation came from the floor about, with all this technology and where we are at age, why can't we make buildings that never catch fire? Why are we still buildings that and I said, my answer was a little bit crass, but I basically said, we can do that, 100% guaranteed. I said, well, why don't we do it? I said, well, the building would be completely concrete. There would be no flammable stuff inside it. No people will be allowed because they'll introduce things to it, which cause the problems. People tend to create changes and make differences. I said, but I'd have an aspirating system, an extinguishing system, a water mist system. I'd have a guy stood in the corner with an extinguisher. I can put all of these detection and extinguishing things in so the fire would never develop. And the lady who asked me the question said, well, that's not practical. I went, oh, now you want to put conditions in the way. Okay. So people have to live. They have to be comfortable. There has to be an environment. You now want to put furniture into a flat, which adds to risks and everything else. So it's always that balance about practicality. And We're finding that a lot of the stuff we're going on at the moment when we're working with government is about emotion versus pragmatism. You know, you've just got to have a realistic solution to things and try very, very best to make sure it works for everybody. That's my kind of introduction to what I'm thinking.
Very comprehensive. And you obviously mentioned that the amount of data that these things are generating now. It's obviously all very well and good having all this data, but Nick, is there, you know, are there solutions? Does FireAngel, for example, have solutions that enable that data to be kind of processed and looked at properly? Is it feed into some kind of software? If you could answer that one.
Yeah, I think, James, a really good example will be the FireAngel Predict technology, which I mentioned earlier. This is it's a separate cloud service, so it links to the FireAngel Connected Cloud. And this is a technology we developed. We filed all the patents in 2014, so this is something that has been around in the thinking for quite some time. And it was a technology that was developed through our partnership with UK Fire and Rescue Services, and through introducing alarms around 2010 that had the ability to get diagnostic information out of the alarms, something we put in place purely for our technical support department to understand, you know, if we were getting returns about why we were getting them back. When we started to see alarms coming back that had been in incidents, we were able to download a little bit of historic information from them, and suddenly the world changed because we got insight into what was happening in properties before the fire. And I'm not talking in the 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes before the fire. I'm talking the days, weeks, and months before the fire. And the reality is that a lot of domestic fires, as Ian says, the problem with buildings is that you introduce people to them. And a lot of domestic fires are started as a result of humans and the result of lifestyle. And what we recognise that in high-risk groups, people weren't just having a fire. It's quite difficult to have a fire. What was happening is within properties, we saw evidence that there were quite a large number of near misses. And unfortunately, after a long enough period of time, the wrong factors came together and those near misses became a fire. So what Predict does is it looks at every device on the FireAngel cloud. So that's around 60,000 devices today. And it looks for events like nuisance alarms, silencing of nuisance alarms, multiple alarms going off at the same time within a property, heat alarms going off in a kitchen, which we know is very, very high risk, in order to build a profile of risk within that property. So a good example would be if somebody in a property maybe wasn't a fantastic cook and they occasionally set their smoke alarm off because they burned cooking, they then went and silenced the smoke alarm, we know that that's relatively low risk behaviour. However, somebody come in who's maybe normally low risk, they're not considered to be vulnerable, they've been out, they've drunk a lot, they've come in, they've decided they want to make chips, they put a chip pan on, they fall asleep in front of the TV, the smoke alarm's going off, they're not even waking up, nobody's reacting. We know that's very, very high risk behaviour. So what Predict does is it creates a non-time critical intervention message back to an organisation, a housing association or community fire safety, to say something high risk is happening within this property. Somebody needs to get in, do a safe and well visit, for example, as Jason mentioned, in order to understand why this high-risk behaviour is happening within a property. And that can be because of a whole host of reasons, such as alcohol abuse, drug misuse are good examples, but also other vulnerabilities like mental health issues, unsafe smoking, all kinds of factors. But it's about creating that intervention to prevent that fire actually starting in the first place.
Excellent. And yeah, you mentioned vulnerabilities here. One of the many issues that obviously came out of the Grenfell inquiry is the lack of support and awareness maybe for disabled residents in fire safety planning. I think lawyers actually involved even described it as a landmark act of discrimination against disabled and vulnerable people. Basilay, how do you think the technologies can support in making buildings more inclusive for those with disabilities? Or what have you been working on over the last year or so that you mentioned earlier?
Thank you. So I want to follow the theme that people live in houses. And 14 million people in the UK are disabled people. That is huge. That's at least 1 in 5. So we're not a marginal group. We're not an add-on. We are part of the population. And 45% of older people are going to have a disability, 19% of working age people, and 8% of children. We are everywhere. And I think that has to be a kind of something that people in the fire and rescue kind of industry as a whole just really, and it's obvious you've done a lot of thinking on that already, but do more thinking on. And at the moment, many more people are going to be temporarily disabled because they can't get the cataract operation, the hip operation. We've got millions more people now who are going to be living with an impairment. So I think, and none of us, no one who's currently non-disabled can assume they're not going to become disabled tomorrow or a few years hence, because it's one of those things that people acquire disability. We're not just all born with them. So I think in terms of what our impairments are, of course that poses your industry some complexity, because some of us can't walk very far, some of us can't walk at all, some of us can't see, some of us are deaf, some of us have mental health problems or cognitive issues like learning disabilities or autism. So we're not very tidy, and we've got a lot of different needs. So when we come to thinking about technology, I think one of the kind of first lessons is how can we make mainstream technologies inclusive? How can we not just think about the additional technologies that are needed because I'm blind or someone else is deaf or someone else is in a wheelchair, but what can we do through mainstream technology? So something that comes to my mind, because I'm blind, is the smart speaker. It wasn't designed for me. Everyone's got a few of them around the house at the moment. But do you know what? It does make my life a bit easier. I can ask the time, I can ask the weather. If I was a bit cleverer, I could ask them to adjust my central heating controls, turn on my lights, turn off my lights, etc. So just, I think, thinking through how the mainstream technologies that you're putting into buildings can really benefit all of us. I think that's a really good place to start. And then, of course, there will be add-ons through personal emergency evacuation plans, people who can't self-evacuate. And in those cases, there might be specific technologies that help individuals. But actually, if the building's been thought about in terms of its inclusivity, I think what's needed in the personal emergency evacuation plans will be easier to sort out. So I think my main message is, and I think you all do this anyway, so I'm probably preaching to the converted, but we must start with the understanding that a big section of the population has disabilities, and actually not giving us the adaptations that we need will make us vulnerable. We're not necessarily always vulnerable until we're left or ignored or made invisible, and then we become vulnerable.
Yeah, that's a really good point at the end there. I totally agree. And Jason, from the Fire and Rescue Services point of view, is this something that's become clearer as obviously the inquiry into Grenfell has happened, or is it just something that there's been thought about more because the technology is now available?
Sorry, could you say that again? I didn't quite catch the end of that, James.
Yeah, no, it's just asking, is this something that the Fire and Rescue Services are thinking about more because of Grenfell and some of the outcomes of that? Is it something that also technology is allowing you to kind of think about better?
Yeah, certainly some of the findings from the Grenfell inquiry around the vulnerability of people within that type of building, and as Fazle has mentioned about the PEEPs, as they're abbreviated to, the ability to contact those people prior to a fire is really, really important, because we need to understand what individual needs there are by those families or individuals living alone. But also knowing how do we access information that tells our crews that they're residents within a building, and then adapting our response accordingly to foster their needs. It's a huge area of conversation, and I'd be really interested to pick up one outside of the room with Fazla, I think, really, to understand more from her perspective of the world, what this actually means for us as a fire and rescue service.
Yeah, for sure. And Nick, just to come in here again, are there particular solutions in the market, from FireAngel, that are specifically aimed at supporting disabled and potentially vulnerable residents living in social housing?
Yeah, there are a number of different solutions. So, FireAngel produce a death alert. It works as part of our existing smart RF wireless system. So you can add that incrementally to a system. It's very, very quick and easy to install. So that enhances the standard installation in order to then give protection to somebody who's got a hearing impairment. But in addition to that, there are a number of other solutions available, things like evac chairs, smoke hoods, emergency lighting is a big factor. There are lots of solutions out there. I think in the past, a lot of the focus on fire safety has been around getting a foundation of fire safety into all properties in the UK. And I think the Safe and Well visits by UK Fire and Rescue Services have done really a world-leading job over the past 15 years at achieving that. And I think now a number of factors are driving that focus to be able to be broader and to ensure that it is a lot more inclusive. But I think another factor which touches on, and Predict is just one example of this type of technology. By using IoT and by having information about what's happening within the property, it gives you the ability to be able to pinpoint who is vulnerable more accurately. And I think this is one of the fundamental and one of the most exciting elements of IoT technology within this space, that is all about connecting things to the internet, and therefore it's connecting information together. And although the fire sector has been relatively slow at adopting IoT because of the nature of our industry, because it is a risk industry, but what's brilliant about fire safety and IoT is there are so many interested stakeholders in fire safety, such as building owners, social services, residents, families, neighbours, not to mention the fire and rescue service. And to be able to have this information in the cloud in a way that it can then be pushed to the correct stakeholder is a real game changer. And I think we're just scratching the surface at the moment of what we're going to see in maybe 10 years' time.
Absolutely. Yeah, some really good points here. I'm just going to sort of move on a little bit to how we engage the industry in this, and residents in particular, and the benefits of technology. Ian, on the launch of the IoT Special Interest Group and the FIA, I think one of your comments was that the Internet of Things promises to transform the fire industry and many other industries. How do you think the industry can best embrace this? And is there something that, in particular, social housing providers, but also installers, building managers, can do to try and sort of better understand it? Is there routes they can follow? Is there information out there?
Yeah, I'm picking up a couple of the comments of the previous people there, but just sort of changing my sort of thoughts on this a little bit, which is good. That's why we interact with each other. But to me, this is about confidence. And you look at fire alarm systems, and we all know that if you're in a building and the bell rings, you tend to sit there looking at each other and waiting for something to happen 9 times out of 10, and eventually you'll move. It's very, very rare people immediately react. I think Grenfell certainly changed that, people's attitude towards it. You talked about interaction of stakeholders and everybody getting involved. That was certainly not the case 5 years ago. And I think that Grenfell has transformed everybody's brain to thinking, I'm in a dangerous and vulnerable position here. And it must be even worse with people with disabilities who think they cannot look after themselves to evacuate themselves in a building when that happens. So they've got to have complete confidence that if that bell or siren or something, or somebody's told them there's an alarm, it's real. And this is why a lot of this data stuff will come down that I'm interested in industry is about false alarm reduction, because it's always been the case that it's relatively easy to detect fires. You know, that's the easy part almost. It's the false alarm rejection that really is the art of designing these systems. And public need to know that if that sounder goes off, if that bell rings, then there is an incident and they need to react accordingly, or, you know, be prepared to react. And there's been a few examples of this. I mean, I remember a long time ago, and I'm talking 20 years ago, the first sort of forays into voice evacuation systems. And they did a test on a Horizon program that's, have a look at it sometime, it's quite fascinating. They had people in a classroom to fill out forms, adults, and they were there for like adult learning reasons. And they basically put the bells off in the corridors, and everybody sat there for 20 minutes, nobody moved. Because the natural assumption was, one, false alarm, unfortunately brought up with this. The other thing is maybe it's a change of, like a school bell would normally be ringing for changing periods of classes and everything else. And eventually somebody walked out and looked down the corridor, and they told the guy just to keep going, and he never came back. And it's almost half an hour before the whole classroom decided to get up and start thinking something's going on here. Yeah, when you do a voice evacuation with exactly the same setup, and the voice said, this is not a test, this is real, there is a fire in the building, evacuate immediately, everybody got up and walked out. Now, very simplistic. This is why people tend to move to that sort of thought patterns. You go to America, it's very prevalent for obvious reasons, voice evacuation. But it's really about people feeling confident in what they're hearing. And all of this data collection in different areas and being absolutely sure through investigation about what you're getting is understanding what creates false alarms and fixing those problems and reducing it lower and lower and lower to people then feel confident. Because I guarantee everybody at this time, you know, in listening to this, will at some point would have been either in a pub, restaurant, or a hotel, and they would just waited. And that is precious time, because all detection systems are designed for spacing and everything else and sensitivities based on time to get it as quick as possible to get people evacuated away from the incident. But we all sit there and we all listen, we all wait, because we're so used to false alarms. So to me, IoT, the biggest influence it can make on industry is collecting data and interacting that data from different sensors, different ideas. You know, even movement detectors can help you decide if there's fires and things, because is there somebody in the room, is there not? All these different algorithms can be built up with all this information to reduce false alarms, so people have absolute confidence that when that alarm goes off, everybody reacts accordingly. So I think of all the exciting things we've got a few platforms coming up to discuss these different things. We need to educate end users on trust in this, because there is a bit of scaremongery about the internet. And then we need to start working on codes of practice, guidance documents. We need to work with British standards to make sure that we are working to a level that is acceptable. And then we can start talking to approval bodies about making sure products fit in line with life safety. There's a very long road to go on this, but I think it's not a case of saying, whoa, slow down, let's not get carried away technology. I think we should be gung-ho getting into this, but finding out. But all of that information needs to be streamlined to make everybody confident that what's happening is secure and is accurate.
Absolutely. I've had a question come in here that's sort of relevant for all of this, and Basil, I'll come to you on this one. The comment is that, you know, many vulnerable or disabled people have no access to IT or the internet and don't always have the same interest in it, preferring old-style communications. So how do we encourage disabled residents, for example, to get involved in this, to understand it? How do we sort of talk to them, and what are the best kind of is there an element of education and reassurance here that we need to kind of put forward to disabled residents for them to understand it?
Well, it's certainly true that the digital divide has a disproportionate impact on disabled people. And that could be because of affordability, it could be because of accessibility, it could be a whole range of reasons to do with a particular impairment. But having said that, there are also enormous numbers of disabled people who have embraced technology and found it liberating. People with chronic illness, people who are younger with sight loss. So it's a really, really mixed picture. And it's interesting what we were just talking about. I think one of the first things I'd say about engagement is that, you know, people must come to this conversation assuming that a lot of disabled people, most of us, spend our days problem solving around our disabilities. We know, you know, we're very capable. We understand what needs to happen. So it's very important that conversation happens between equals, you know, people who understand fire and the Internet of Things and people who understand disability, and we come together to try and solve these issues. Because, you know, we problem solve nearly all the time. The other thing to say about information is that at Grenfell, they were drowning in information. They just didn't use any of it. They had 2 systems. They knew all about the impairments. They were in and out of that block all the time, the managing agents. And they just didn't use the information to plan and to share in the right way. And actually, you know, bureaucracies, and I'm sure housing associations and councils are awash with information. And I think the issue really is what some of the other speakers have been talking about, is how we corral it and share it, keep it up to date. But really, you know, these are things that are part of being a landlord. It's nothing unusual. And we just need to apply the same rigor we have to processes around electrical checks and all that sort of thing, to understanding the needs of disabled residents and what needs to be put in place. So yeah, nothing's straightforward. And as I said earlier, because disabled people have a range of impairments, you know, the first issue has to be, what does inclusive design mean? And then the second issue is, what do we need to top that up for an individual? Obviously, it gets more complex if people have capacity problems in understanding because of dementia or, you know, for other reasons. But for a lot of the 14 million I'm talking about, we will have a very good idea of how we can support ourselves and work with others to make sure that we do evacuate in the event of a fire.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick, are there devices that, you know, FireAngel have worked on that maybe cover specific disabilities, or they cover they try and cover a range of disabilities? Is that something that you've looked into?
Only really around death alerts. That's the one area where we've had specific solutions, and that was a solution that we developed in partnership with UK Fire and Rescue Services. It's a device they've demanded as part of their community fire safety work. So we developed a solution. We also have, for example, relay solutions that work as part of the system, so it can link into other systems. And I think having that flexibility is very, very key. Yeah, looking at IoT and the implications of IoT, we've got the potential of cloud-to-cloud integration using APIs. And that then becomes a game changer, because if you've got multiple IoT systems within a property, integration on a property level can sometimes be expensive, difficult, involving spending time in the property, which isn't always ideal for the residents. But by being able to use cloud-to-cloud integration, we've got the potential of knitting into all different types of systems. And I think that's where I see the future of fire safety within IoT, particularly around domestic, in that we'll do the bit that we do really well. We'll do the sensing, understanding the sensing, creating that automated stratification of risk, creating the automated documentation around what's happening within the property. But there are lots of other systems and devices that are now smart within properties that can play a part in the overall picture of understanding there's an issue, but then alerting around the issue and getting people out. And interestingly, I've seen one of the questions that's come up on a Q&A is around language, because with traditional voice systems, there is a pre-recording and that recording is pushed out. If you look at the smart technology we all have in our homes, there's the ability to choose and tailor that message based on your native language. So this is where this type of technology is very exciting and really flexible.
And I imagine that kind of connects to the smart speakers that you obviously mentioned earlier, Fazle, maybe connecting, you know, alarm systems to that. That kind of thing could be very useful. Everyone here has mentioned about partnerships and collaboration. Nick, you mentioned it a few times with the fire and rescue services. Jason, how important do you think partnerships and collaboration will be in improving fire safety via the use of kind of IoT and technology? And how are the fire and rescue services in particular working with housing providers to kind of help educate and inform them on this new developments?
Thanks, James. Well, so if we kind of cast our minds back to 2017, and I was not going to bore everyone with a massive amount of just legislation, but the Police and Crime Act placed a statutory duty on emergency services to collaborate. And the intention of that piece of legislation is to accelerate and help improve change and to embed collaboration as the norm in making our community safer. So although this legal duty doesn't apply directly to other agencies, the ability to collaborate with all relevant partners, including housing providers, is essential for all fire and rescue services in the delivery of their community risk management plans, which is that strategic plan to reduce risk within areas of responsibility. So collaboration brings scales of economy for all parties. It increases the speed in which improvements can be delivered to the public. And it also enables partners to achieve common goals more effectively. And that's the essence of partnership working for me. Yeah. So in this instance, when we're talking about IoT and housing providers, collaboration does help to protect and save lives. It also protect property from fires which undetected would have had greater financial and business continuity impacts on housing providers. So, when we start thinking about the benefits to the individual, but then to organisations, it will help reduce demand on fire and rescue services. For housing providers, it is an insurance policy, if you like, around preventing further damage to housing stock and then the financial costs to repair them. I suppose the challenge to all fire and rescue service is, and the one we face, is the ability to directly access those people that are identified as vulnerable for whatever reason, and to get to meet them face to face, or even virtually. We've talked about access to the internet, but to be able to educate and inform them on the dangers from fire. We don't have any legal powers to enter single domestic dwellings, so we rely heavily on referrals from partners or working in partnership with housing providers. So through our work with both housing associations and local authorities, we can access those most vulnerable from fire and deliver life-changing interventions. However, I would like to see more and more partnerships develop between fire and rescue services, because the provision of safe and well visits is free. We can provide the expertise to educate and inform. We can go back and revisit to make sure that behavioural changes that need to be adopted have happened. And I work locally through strategic housing officer groups to help influence and help adopt new ways of working with housing providers. Through our primary authority scheme, we are partnered with a number of large housing providers. It's creating that, and I don't want to use the connection in terms of an IT connection. It's about that partnership, that person-to-person connection, then coming up with MOUs or systems that support that bit where we link all of the work that comes from Ian and Nick's world in terms of developing the new technology and the new systems. So how do we get across the threshold? That's the biggest challenge for me. We've had those discussions about how we share data, share information legally and ethically correctly, but how do we actually make sure that the detection and the trending that comes out this new emerging technology gives us line of sight to an individual that needs that intervention today and not when they've had a fire. I mean, the stuff that's been developed by FireAngel is really exciting for me in terms of that. When we talk about early detection, it's about tracking and trending behaviours in people that have low levels of vulnerability now, but in 6 months' time are highly vulnerable. We want to speak to them before that vulnerability increases to a point where we are reacting to and not being proactive to that risk.
Absolutely, and it's a real game changer in being able to be proactive, I think, in the fire safety industry for sure. On the sort of game changers, Ian, it's sort of been mentioned briefly earlier. Standards are obviously vital in the fire safety sector for good reason. But similarly, perhaps to the intruder alarm industry and the security sector, sometimes think they can stifle innovation a little bit if they're not quick enough to embrace tech such as the IoT in the cloud. What would you say to this, and how do we develop the standards? I guess the special interest group that's one of the primary aims, I imagine.
Yeah, I think one of the things we don't want to be doing, in my view, is just trying to adapt current standards, which is a classical thing the fire industry tends to do. They come up with a different technology. As an example, you see like a water mist system and a sprinkler system. I'll just pick those out of the air. And you've got to sort of take away how do you make the water mist system fit the sprinkler standard by a few adaptations and everything else. So this is new technology, and we've got to be bold with this type of information. But I think the starting point really for us using Internet of Things is using existing products with existing compliance, but using the information better. And when we talk about maintenance as an example, you know, if you can see things coming, like Nick was alluding to earlier, but not to that depth, even to more basic depths. You look at the age of a detector, and there's a lot of discussion about it at the moment. BRE have just put a report out about age of detectors, and they're talking about domestic detectors at the time. But it's so difficult to do because not one size fits all. I know that in my lounge, a detector, and I'm very lucky to have a pub right next door to me where I live, but I can imagine a detector in their kitchen, you know, doing the same like another smoke detector. Mine will last longer than theirs because of the extremes of heat that damage semiconductors. It's not just about getting dirty because they can clean them and you can get drift compensation. There's a whole load of technology that adapts things. But having data to do preventative maintenance on all devices, you know, is absolutely vital. So I think the first stage for us is using existing technology, but using the data a little bit smarter. Then you move towards signals, because fire alarm systems are very comfortable operating separately and then giving the information to somebody else, which they can do what they like with it. What fire alarm systems with standards don't like is somebody coming into the fire alarm system to say, change the sensitivity of this, adapt this, change this. It goes against all the principles of what we've been doing with British standards and European standards. So I think codes of practice, Fazile mentioned before about rafts of information coming to people. Everybody's got information about everything. So the overload is not going to help. But I'll just go back to that word of confidence, you know, that keep it, you know, succinct in what you're trying to explain. These are the facts. This is how it will help you. These are the benefits of these different things. And then we can start moving towards changing codes of practice, guidelines, British standards about how we can connect and what we can and can't do. And then, of course, you then look to test that. Therefore, the approval bodies will come in. And all of those people are very, very much involved in our forum right now from day one. They know it's coming. It's going to be a long, long way away before the approval bodies start getting involved. But they're getting involved right now to listen to why it's going the direction it's going from everybody, from manufacturers to end users to fire and rescue services involved in it as well. It's about how they can use it. So to me, it's about one step at a time. Don't suddenly replace everything with an IoT system that does everything you can possibly think of. But the integration should come slowly, in my view, but be ready to go at steps very, very quickly so you're not affecting the speed of innovation. And how you make it useful for everybody to be more encompassing. Fascinated to hear Fazile's views on everyday products are very, very useful to disabled people. You just don't pick up on it because, you know, if you're not disabled, you don't think of those things. That's why the engagement is unbelievably useful, because you may suddenly find in your development works, oh, that would be very, very useful to a blind person, as an example. Anyway, that would be my thoughts on that.
Excellent, yeah, and certainly it's something that I hadn't thought about either, the use of everyday products to and the engagement is always a big part of all of this, I think, with everything in fire safety. We've had questions coming in throughout, so thank you everyone. We've only got a few minutes left. I'm just going to fire a quick couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up. But firstly, there was a question earlier, and again, Ian briefly touched on it, but Nick, could connected fire technology potentially be considered a cybersecurity risk, and potentially to privacy? How do we guard against this? Okay,
there's two very, very big subjects there, both cybersecurity and from a data perspective. For the way we've looked at it at FireAngel, and look, it's something that's part of the ongoing evolution of our system. First of all, from a cybersecurity perspective, we've taken our existing certified alarms, which meet the European smoke alarm standards. So, as Ian mentions, taking existing devices and knitting them into a system, but they're effectively ring-fenced from the system. So they will always work as self-contained standalone smoke alarms, even if something happened to the IoT system, because that's the fundamental job of those products. So that was a way of us easily, we can't always know we've 100% solved the problem forever. We've got to constantly keep working on it, but we can do something in the short term to ensure that the most critical function of the device is ring-fenced and protected. So that's the view that we've taken. Privacy is another very, very big subject. The beauty of IoT is it gives that richness of information of what's happening within a property. And if you could knit all the information together that you can extract from a property, it give you a fantastic end-to-end picture, which would allow from a fire and rescue service, for example, Jason, that would really help your interventions. GDPR, the nature of the legislation is what it is. We've managed to work around it with both our FireAngel Connected platform and our FireAngel Predict to ensure that we are compliant and we meet that. Again, it's something that requires ongoing work, but we can meet the legislation comfortably today.
Excellent. And final question here, just a quick one for you, Fazale. What's your current perspective of the technology in terms of working with the government to influence their plans for sort of personal emergency evacuation plans?
Well, two things. One is on personal emergency evacuation plans. The consultation closed on the 19th of July, and the government has committed to putting regulations before Parliament before the end of October, because that's 2 years since the Grenfell recommendations on this issue came out. So we're just waiting, and we didn't want them to be an artificial, you must have a personal emergency plan if you're in a building that's higher than 18 metres. We thought that was ridiculous. We want anyone who needs one to have a plan. And we want the responsibility to be on building owners and managing agents to do that education, to actually advise tenants and residents of their rights to a PEEP. In terms of technology, the recent government strategy, the National Disability Strategy that was produced at the end of July, has quite a lot in about assistive technology and how the government wants to use the research budget it's got, but also put some new funding into assistive and accessible technologies. I don't think it was particularly thinking of fire, but actually, from the conversation today, it may be that some of that government technology funding could help accelerate some of the things people are talking about. I think my last message would be just, treat disabled people as equal and as having a good view on how they can get out of trouble if they need to, and keep things very simple. I know, we can talk about the Internet of Things and all these complicated things, but I actually don't need to know what's under the bonnet, do I? I just need to be able to interface with it in a very simple, consumer-friendly way. So I think, and that's not just me as a blind person, that probably goes for the whole of the population. So what's good for me is good for everyone.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. But thank you so much, Nick, Fazile, Ian, and Jason. We really do appreciate your time, and I'm sure all the attendees do on your expertise on today's topic. If anyone needs to get in contact with anyone else here, I know there's a couple of questions we didn't have time to answer. Either there should be some contact details on the widget at the bottom of your screen, or just give me an email. It's james.moore, N-O-O-R-E, @informa.com, and I can set forward the messages on. And we've had some really good feedback from attendees, so thank you very much for attending. Some really interesting points raised, I think. I think the fire safety is obviously very much at the forefront at the moment, and rightly so, to prevent further events such as Grenfell and others from happening again. Obviously, we need to be careful with new technology and ensure that it's ready to do what it says it can. But I wonder if, after listening to today's discussion, I wonder if there's no better time to embrace new options such as connected devices and start linking them up. Almost everything is connected to something in 2021, so why not fire alarms and detection devices, I guess. No doubt there's been a lot to think about for many here, and clearly with the new special interest group, it's something the FIA will continue to explore with its members, alongside vendors such as FireAngel specialising in the subject. As always, communication and collaboration in the sector will be the key in its evolution, I think, and I think that everybody agreed with that here and mentioned that at various points. Thank you to our sponsor, finally, FireAngel, as well as to everyone in the audience. We do hope you enjoyed the session, and we really appreciate you coming along and attending. If you'd like to keep up to date with future webinars from IFSEC Global and all the latest news from the industry, please be sure to just sign up to our weekly fire briefing newsletter. There should be a link in the resources section, which also has some stuff from FireAngel as well. And within the next 24 hours, you will receive a personalised follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. So please feel free to invite any colleagues who may have missed this or who may not have been able to listen today. But that's all from today. Thank you for your time. Have a good rest of your day, and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.